Welcome back to the 31st Annual Nebraska Data Users Conference. Next, we have a panel of fresh faces to our conference that will explore and discuss the new realities of state and local finances. Before we introduce you to our presenters, we want to make you aware of several data products developed by the Center for Public Affairs Research on this topic next. So we have the new Nebraska Economic Recovery Dashboard. This is a project from the Center for Public Affairs Research along with the Planning Committee of the Nebraska State Legislature. Covers about 25 economic indicators. Great dashboard that will keep updated throughout COVID-19 and into recovery so we can see what's happening here in Nebraska. We also have governing.unomaha.edu that has a section on economics and state and local government finances, several tax data sets on there. And then we have two recent surveys of Nebraska's businesses about the impact of COVID-19. We just updated that in June, and we'll do a new survey in September or October, and we'll have that updated as well. Be checking back for more information on these topics. Now, let's introduce you to our panel, who I have to say are wonderful scholars and actually really great friends as well. First up, we'll have Chris Decker. He's chair and professor of the UNO School of Economics. He teaches a range of courses in economics and works with a wide range of local agencies to conduct economic assessments. Recently, he produced a series of talks available on YouTube about the impacts of COVID-19 on unemployment. You're going to get a glimpse here, but be sure to check those out in full. Greg Maher is director and professor of the UNO School of Public Administration. He's widely published in the field of public budgeting and finance. He regularly uses his practical experience as a city council member in Wisconsin to inform his academic work, including his recent survey research on the impacts of COVID-19 on local government finances. Finally, Bruce McDonald. He's an associate professor at North Carolina State University's Department of Public Administration. He's a prolific scholar of fiscal health and local governance. He's also the editor of the Journal of Public Affairs Education and a co-host, along with myself, of the podcast Academics of Public Administration. Welcome all. Thank you for being here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Chris, thanks for being here.
Yeah, great. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Yes, great. Okay. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. So let me see if I can get my slides going here. I'm going to try to share my screen. As I've explained to people, sometimes technology and I aren't the closest of friends. So let's see, does that work? Can you folks see my slides?
It is there.
Fantastic. Let me get my slideshow going here. I will do my best to be brief. And cut me off if I go long. I'm sure Josie has no problem doing that. Okay, so yeah, as Josie mentioned, I've been doing a series of recordings that are available on YouTube because when this whole COVID thing hit, back in March, I started getting a lot of questions from a lot of different folks like, okay, we've seen some major disruptions in the labor market, how deep is this recession going to be? How long is this recession going to last in Nebraska? What about Omaha? I didn't have a lot of great answers because I was really hoping to find some higher frequency forecast, something more than just a quarterly or an annual forecast. So I started collecting some data and monitoring some data that's generally available on a weekly basis and trying to forecast those series. And then I tried to match that up with some monthly data that I look at to also get a sense of what's happening on a monthly basis. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about the nature of my little project here, and hopefully that'll spark some interest and perhaps provide Greg and Bruce some other thoughts as they go forward. I'm going to start by looking at a very commonly reported series in the news. This is a graph of Nebraska initial filings for unemployment compensation. It's tracked weekly and reported out by the U.S. Department of Labor and the Nebraska Department of Labor. And what I've got here is a data plot really covering the last major expansion in our state's economy, going back to the Great Recession and through right up until COVID hit. And you can see that at the height of the Great Recession in terms of the labor market, we had a peak of about 4,000 new claim filings in early January of 2010. And then you saw the steady decline down as you'd expect with any expansion. We had a very healthy economy going forward. I like this plot because it's a frightening contrast to the next plot where we introduce the COVID effect. This is not unusual for Nebraska. Just about every single state experienced this kind of jump up, and we had closings and partial closings and bars and restaurants and retail establishments and gymnasiums closing down and furloughing workers, we saw a huge spike in initial claims. Not surprising, but what was surprising to me was the magnitude. In 1 week's time, we had 26,539 claims. This is an overwhelmingly large number, and this data series goes back further than 2008. I've never seen anything like this. The good news is we've had some declines in that number. And this is no longer the latest number, but I actually have the latest number for you. So we'll have some real-time economics here to share with you shortly. The latest weekly numbers are right around 3,000. So we've come down. Our long-term trend is about 700 or 800 on a weekly basis on average. We got a ways to go, but at least we're heading in the right direction. But this is really what sparked the concern. All these layoffs, and how deep is this recession? How long is it going to last? Another series that I started looking at and trying to forecast was a series that's not reported as much. It's this Nebraska continuing employment. So you file for unemployment, how long or how many stay on employment beyond that. And this series, again, accelerated as you would expect. We peaked at about 70,000 or so back in late April. It has been slowly, perhaps painfully slowly falling, but usually that's a good sign, right? Because that suggests that for the most part, people are coming off from furlough or they're finding employment. The latest number was about 37, 38,000 or so. So the trend's in the right direction. It's just been really slow. But it's this weekly data that I wanted to forecast and use to capture a sense of where total jobs were heading in the state and in the Omaha metro area. And I have found these graphs, every time I look at them, I put these graphs together and I'm stunned every time I look at them. When we first started working our way out of the Great Recession back in, we had a bottom out in about February 2010 till February 2020, we had added about 99,000 jobs on a seasonally adjusted basis in the state. And in a matter of 2 months, we lost 92,000 jobs. Now, we've gotten some of those back. The CARES Act certainly helped in May and June. June was a banner month for job recovery. We ended up back at about 974,000 jobs, but nowhere near where we were beforehand. The phased reopening helped as well. So the big questions are what's going to happen here in July, and I know July's in the past, but we don't have a number yet. I'll explain later. And August, September, and into the end of 2020. Similar kind of story for Omaha. You know, our previous expansion added a little over 60,000 jobs, and we lost about 50,000 in a very short period of time, gotten some of those back. These kinds of drops are totally unprecedented. I could take this series back to the early 1950s, and we've never seen any drop like this before. So these are dramatic, and it's a natural to ask the question, where are we heading, and for how long are we going to be kind of underwater here? Where are we going to ever be back to pre-COVID levels of employment? So this was the nature of my project. I wanted a high-frequency forecast. So what I did was I looked at some of the historical patterns in weekly claims and weekly continuing claims, and estimated an econometric equation and kind of extrapolated that out. And by the way, if you want any of these statistical models, I'll be happy to share them with you. I don't want to bore you with all the details. Trust me, it'll not be worth our time. And then I used those forecasts to forecast monthly employment in the state and in the city of Omaha. So for example, I'm just going to point out a few salient issues here with respect to the Nebraska employment equation. That weekly initial claims series really has proven to be a good predictor, and it's usually the first 2 weeks of weekly unemployment claims data that tends to produce or tends to predict best the monthly employment data. That'll become relevant when I talk about the monthly forecast later. Also, I have the national employment numbers in there. The reason for that is there's a time lag. Like right now, we know that we added about 1.9 million, 1.8, I think it was, million jobs in July nationwide. Well, we don't know yet about July's Nebraska numbers. Those numbers actually come out, well, they actually come out tomorrow. So you'll be able to check tomorrow how right or wrong I am on my July forecast. That's real-time economics, I guess. But again, it's those initial claims which really seems to be a very good predictor. Similar kind of specification for Omaha, although I model Omaha as a share of total Nebraska employment. Similar kind of pattern arises. Those first 2 weeks of initial claims seem to matter a lot. So just to give you an idea of what my model looked like in terms of a forecast, if you can see that reddish colored line, I produced this forecast back in May, and then I've just been tracking the actual data since then. And this model for Nebraska and for Omaha was doing remarkably well, stunningly well. I've never had that kind of luck before with a forecast, right up until the last week of June, and then we saw a bump. And that bump disturbed me because that was about the time when a lot of states were experiencing outbreaks, and I was concerned that they were going to be shutting down their economies in other states, and that would impact Omaha and Nebraska to the extent that our businesses do business with companies outside the state. Perhaps fortunately, we might have had enough momentum in our economy to bring those unemployment claims back down. So we ended the month of July and started the month of August off very strong. I'm going to point out here, by the way, that this 2631 was the last data point as of about a half hour ago. The latest week of data put us at, I'm just going to point this out to you, about a half hour ago I looked it up, it was about 3189. So we did bounce up a little bit, and I had forecast about 29. So what we're looking at here is a little bit of an uptick. I'm not too surprised, and I suspect that maybe towards the end of August and early September, we might see more of an uptick anyway. The CARES Act expired. We got that additional stimulus disappearing that could reduce consumer spending. That might have implications for the job market. So my thinking is that we might have a bit of an uptick here going forward, but I still think long-term momentum might be slowly and steadily bringing us back down to long-term trend. And by the way, similar kind of story here for continuing claims. The trend is still in the right direction. We had that bump up in July, but we seem to have gotten back on track. Could have a little bit of a bump up here in September relative to my forecast. Again, for the same reasons. We still have an economy that's sick. It's a sick patient. We need to give it a little bit more medicine to make sure that we have a sustainable path forward. So what about July? I know it sounds kind of silly to ask about July, but you know, we'll see the data for July tomorrow. I'm thinking July is going to be a slowdown relative to June for a variety of reasons. We had that uptick in unemployment claims in the first 2 weeks. And like I said, that's a pretty good predictor of where the month is going to go in terms of job growth. We'll have some job growth, but it's not going to be as good as May or June. I'll show you some numbers in a little bit on that front. And speaking about some of the more recent forecasts period, if you look at August and September, with the CARES Act expiring, and my personal feeling is that the executive actions taken by the president are really not going to have any kind of substantive effect near term. I'm not even sure they're going to have an effect at all. They might spur some additional negotiations. We'll see about that. So I think August and September, we might have kind of a slower growth scenario as well. I think COVID cases, you know, they were getting a little bit out of hand, certainly in Douglas County here over the last few weeks, but I think we might have things under control, knock on wood. But schools are reopening and there are already reports of outbreaks. So this generates a lot of uncertainty on the part of consumers, and that can impact business hiring decisions. We're off to a good start with August. But again, I think the dramatic growth we saw in jobs in May and June aren't going to transpire over the next 3 months. So what about the numbers? Let's take a quick look at the numbers here. We gained about 11,000 jobs back in May, about 18,000 jobs back in June in Nebraska. My guess is that tomorrow we'll see some growth, but not near 17,000. I think right now I'm thinking 3,500 additional jobs. That could be conservative. It could be a little higher than that, but it's definitely not going to be 10,000 or more. I think we've got a slowdown here that we're managing. Similar with August and September. I think we'll pick up a little bit of steam as we get into September and the rest of the year. I do think that my fingers are crossed. Maybe this is hope and not logic, but I think a second stimulus will occur. It's kind of stupid that it hasn't yet. Again, I think we'll have modest growth in the city as well, but not near where we were in June. Longer term, how are we going to finish out this year? And if you're anything like me, you can't wait for 2020 to end. I think nationally, we're going to see some slowdown as well. I like tracking this JP Morgan series on credit card transactions. You can kind of see the way things have slowed here through most of July. I think that's likely going to continue. unless and until we can get a really good handle on these COVID cases. And right now the numbers are looking better than they were a few weeks ago. But still, there's a fair amount of uncertainty regarding COVID in the markets. I'm going to let my colleagues talk more about the net taxable sales story here in the state of Nebraska, but it's been abysmal when compared to 2019. I suspect that's likely going to be the case for the next few months going forward. Like I said, this is what COVID cases look like in Nebraska as of August 4th. We had this uptick. I think we've stabilized. The mask mandate in Lancaster County, I think, has been pretty successful, and I'm hopeful that that's true here in Omaha as well. I think that will lend some certainty to our economic outlook. When I'm asked, and I have been asked, okay, when are we going to be back to where we were before all this stuff happened? My model is suggesting that under reasonable conditions, I think reasonable conditions, we could be back to pre-COVID levels by December of 2021. And depending on your perspective, that could be a long time, could be a short time. But I think that's a reasonable guess going forward. You know, I've heard stories about how the national economy is going to take a long time to recover, perhaps years and years. Omaha and Nebraska have generally pretty resilient economies, and our recessions tend to be shorter than most, and other states, and perhaps less deep than other states. So I think that this is not an unreasonable projection under certain conditions. First of all, I do think we need a short-term stimulus. The patient's still sick. The labor demand is still down. Too many unemployed people chasing too few jobs. I don't think an additional stimulus is going to discourage people from looking for work. Certainly not in Nebraska with Nebraskans' work ethics. They'd rather work than anything else. When you look at this ratio, it's far too high. I think that we need a little bit more spending help for consumers. And maintaining contagion control is going to be critically important in my judgment. I tell my principals this all the time. If you want to disrupt a market, introduce uncertainty. Because if consumers aren't comfortable with their own economic conditions, if they're worried about their job, if they're worried about their spouse's job or their friend's job or their family members' jobs, they're not going to spend a lot of money. And if that's the case, then frankly, businesses aren't going to invest. And if they're not going to invest, they're not going to hire. So to the extent we can control this contagion until we have an effective vaccine, we're going to do much better. We're going to be able to reach these return levels of employment by the end of 2021, in my judgment. So that's just a snapshot of what I've been doing and where I'm thinking things are currently right now. And if you have an interest in any of the data that I look at, these are the websites that I look at. And with that, I think it would be best if we start talking about state and local finances. And I'm going to turn this over to Craig at this point.
Thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, as Craig's getting it up, we did just have one question about where your data was coming from. And so you're using, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about the data that goes into the model?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen again. I just stopped doing that. So let's see if I can get that back here. Whoops, that's the wrong one. No, here we go.
Yep, that's great.
Yeah, we'll kind of, oh, that's great. Yeah, okay. Well, the data that I'm getting is largely coming from the Nebraska Department of Labor. The websites are on the last slide of my presentation.
We'll share it out for sure.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And then for the monthly employment data, I've been looking I've been doing this for years. I've been looking primarily at the U.S. Department of Labor's current employment situation, because that tends to provide me with the most recent state and metro level jobs data. You can get that seasonally adjusted, which is what I like to do. I like to remove the seasonality, kind of get what the overall underlying trends are. It's pretty easy to access, and it's very easy to manipulate. I put all this data, I dump it into Excel, and then I dump it into a couple of different statistical packages that I play around with. So those are the primary data sources that I've been using.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. And next up is Craig Maher.
Hello, everybody. Great to, I guess, virtually see. It's amazing. There are 172 participants. Bruce and I were just joking. We think the last time we presented, it was maybe to a panel of 10. So it's great to have such a captive audience. And I think that Chris's work really sets up these next two presentations. So what I'm going to present is on some work that I conducted with a couple of colleagues, really at sort of the onset of the responses to the pandemic. And so what we did is we conducted a survey in early to mid-April, and the survey primarily went out to local officials, municipal, county, but also nonprofits. We have a lot of our graduates from our MPA program or the nonprofit sector, and we were able to reach out to them. But what I wanted to just share with you is the timing of this, and this just seems like a lifetime ago. But when this survey began, this was early April, so 2 weeks prior, the U.S. had 2,900 confirmed COVID cases. When the survey went out, the number of confirmed cases jumped to 215,000, and we had 5,000 deaths. And again, this is across the U.S., obviously. When the survey ended, 2 weeks later, we were up to over 600,000 confirmed cases and over 26,000 deaths. By that time, 42 states and DC issued stay-home orders, and so the ramifications of COVID were spiraling into this recession to which Chris did a wonderful job setting up. So what we were trying to do, this is something very similar to what I've done in other institutions I've been at. I've been really interested in trying to understand the financial health, if you want to say, of local governments. And we thought that in April was a great time to try to figure out what the financial health was of these entities, local governments and nonprofits, primarily in Nebraska. But we also had some pretty good representation in the contiguous states of Iowa and Kansas. We also wanted to know what these communities and nonprofits were doing in response, or in sort of in terms of coping with the effects of COVID-19, and what their intentions are, what they were thinking about moving into the next budget cycle. And so this is, I think, a pretty telling sign. If you notice that about 40% of municipal governments at that time felt that they were in pretty good financial health, whereas just over a quarter of nonprofits felt that they were in pretty good financial health. And interestingly, similarly, both counties and nonprofits, about 40% of them had the perception that they were in difficult financial conditions. So the point is, in April, nonprofits were affected by this much more quickly and much more significantly than local governments, primarily municipalities. And what we know, and hopefully Bruce will agree, since we've done a lot of work together, what we wanted to know is in these coping strategies, in these response strategies, there are some pretty important things that we pay attention to. So things like financial capacity. When going into a recession, we look at things like reserves. How much of a fund balance do these entities have in preparation for? What are their debt levels, right? Cash flow. So what do these entities have in the bank so that they can meet payroll, so that they can meet monthly, weekly expenses? We also look at things like revenue diversity. So is an entity heavily reliant on one revenue source? Are they reliant on an array of revenue sources? At the local level, we would think about property taxes. We think about sales taxes. We may think about a variety of fees and charges, state aids in particular. But then the flip side of that is what's really important, especially in a recession period, is the elasticity of those revenues. And so to what effect does, to Chris's point, to what effect do these economic shifts impact revenue collection? And so Nebraskan governments local governments were relatively, I don't want to say saved or insulated, but they weren't hit as bad as I think you're going to see in Bruce's presentation, because Nebraska local governments rely heavily on property taxes, and that's probably the safest revenue source that a local government could hit or could rely on. As I mentioned, nonprofits were hit hard, and they were hit fast. And this played out on both the revenue side, but also on the service provision side. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. And what was really interesting and really resonated with me, because as Chris, we often look to compare the extent to which what this current recession looks like relative to what has been arguably the worst recession we've faced in few generations, and that is the 2007, 2008, 9. Almost half of the nonprofits considered in April the effects of COVID much worse than the recession of 2007, 2008, 9. Compare that to about a quarter of municipalities and only 20% of counties. So clearly very different impacts when you look at nonprofits to local governments. The Nonprofit Association of Midlands has been a huge player in helping support struggling nonprofits, and they sort of provide an infrastructure and a sort of a one-stop shop for those those nonprofits who are in need. And I mean, look at the findings for a survey that they conducted in April, May. So pretty much all nonprofits canceled events and programs. So all of those means by which they were collecting revenue were pretty much cut off. And over half of those nonprofits had experienced a direct impact on their revenue streams and operations. What we know is that nonprofits operate on sort of shoestring budgets, at least relative to local governments. So this has been and will continue to be a significant challenge for many of those service providers. When we then asked, what are your intentions, or what are you thinking about moving forward? I want to compare nonprofit responses to those of local governments. And so if you look at what nonprofits are doing sort of in this cutback management world that Bruce and I tend to study, nonprofits are making probably some of those most difficult decisions already in April and in May. So you're talking about spending cuts, you're talking about freezing hiring and salaries, you're talking about laying people off. All of these are pretty difficult, but also note that you're seeing some innovation already from these nonprofits. And so what I mean by that is there's development of online programming. There are already discussions about sharing service delivery strategies with similar types of nonprofits. And so they were already thinking innovatively, strategically about how best to come out of this pandemic. If you look at local governments, on the other hand, in April, for most of them, this was really sort of a wait and see. Their responses to what they were planning to do were far more ambiguous. The most frequent response was, we don't know, we're just going to wait and see what happens. And you can understand why, because most governments in Nebraska are heavily reliant on property taxes. And so that revenue was already there, it was safe, and it was secure. Now juxtapose that to some of our larger cities like Lincoln and Omaha, where major events were canceled. You know, the College World Series, right, canceled in Omaha. That was a $70 million hit. I'm thinking about Lincoln and the fact that the Big Ten has canceled the football season. Well, clearly that's going to have some pretty dramatic effects on the revenue for those two cities that do generate a good chunk of their money from sales tax collections and room taxes and beverage taxes and the like. But what's interesting too is we often talk about rainy day funds or reserves, and what's really interesting is there's this hesitancy to draw down reserves, which is not uncommon, but it's still, to me, a little bit baffling. And part of that reasoning is that there is a fear that rating agencies, your Moody's and S&P, will perceive drawing down reserves as a sign of financial weakness. So despite the fact that you have money set aside for these types of events, that tends to be one of the last things they do, which is, to me, is a little bit disturbing. Other things that had been discussed I think are pretty boilerplate responses. So you're looking at freezing or cutting discretionary spending. You're looking at deferring, cutting capital maintenance spending, and you're looking on the personnel side of doing some salary freezes, some benefit cuts, and hiring freezes. Those aren't nearly as dramatic when you compare those to what the nonprofits were facing at the same time. Longer term effects, I think this is a really interesting opportunity, because what we know is this pandemic has really altered workplace dynamics, primarily on people working from home. I know I direct a school. All of my staff have their computers, all their systems, phones they're all working from home now. They're able to communicate with students, advise students through things like Zoom, and it seems to be working just fine. The same thing is happening at all types of organizations. And what's really interesting is, I'd be interested is, what impact this could have on, for instance, the commercial market, because we are starting to see some businesses scaling back on their size, because it seems to be more efficient to have some people at least working from home. And the same thing is applying, I think, in the government sector as well. The other part of this is what we're doing. Everything is now being done virtually, and what that does is it puts additional pressure on IT services, which I've worked in local government. When in a recession, that tends to be one of the first things that's cut. Well, this is a very different animal, and so there's going to need to be some pretty serious investment in IT, in security, because more services, I believe, will be done online. So paying property tax bills, paying for certain fees, will all be done online. Well, you have to make sure that those processes are secure. And so that's going to, I think, raise some interesting discussions about how that is done in the most effective and efficient way. I also wonder too, because we're talking about governments, we're talking about an environment in which we're operating. I wonder how long it's going to take for, let's say, for instance, a neighbor or somebody in the community video recording a city employee who is out walking their dog and posting on social media and screaming about the waste of tax dollars. And so this is going to put sort of additional pressure, I think, particularly on HR in terms of how does one assess workload effectiveness and the like. These aren't conversations that are new, but I also think they are deserving of more perhaps in-depth conversation than had been the case in the past. There are other important questions. Chris has already talked about what the economic recovery is going to look like. There's also questions about the role of state and federal governments. I think one of the biggest frustrations in Nebraska is at the municipal side is that no city was large enough to get CARES Act funding directly. So now they have to interact with the states. And that's posing some real challenges. And then on our end, we do a lot of work on fiscal monitoring. And so I think about half the states right now have some form of monitoring system. Nebraska doesn't. And so what might something like that look like so that states may be able to step in and address some of these financial problems before they reach that sort of bankruptcy stage that we hear about in Detroit and Flint, for instance. So that's all I have. If you're interested in the study, here's a hyperlink to it, and I look forward to feedback. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Craig. We do have a question for you while Bruce goes ahead and sets up. So local governments in Nebraska are heavily reliant on property taxes, and I think we're going to see that other states are not that way. But someone asks, so we're heavily reliant on property taxes, so we're feeling good now. But let's say the pandemic continues, workforce layoffs, home foreclosures, that long term would affect property tax revenues, correct? And what do you think that will look like, maybe at a time frame, and how large?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is Mayor Stoddard here in Omaha presented a budget for the city not too long ago, and I was asked to react to it. And the executive budget was pretty much everything is going to be fine. I think she was actually planning for a 4% increase relative to the current year, and I was baffled by it. And I think exactly to the questioner's point, there's going to be pressure on ability to pay, and we've seen that in the past. And so I do think, to Chris's point, if there isn't an additional stimulus, if this economy does not recover, I am so hopeful that Chris is correct that we're back to pre-COVID-19 levels by the end of 21. If that continues, there are going to be pretty dramatic effects on ability to pay. So I don't care what I hear about tax rates. I want to know if those people who are getting those tax bills are actually able to pay them. And I really wonder what that's going to look like, especially in a city like Omaha at the end of this fiscal year, or entering the next fiscal year.
Thank you so much. Next up, Bruce McDonald. Thanks for being here. You're muted. It's okay, I did it yesterday. I know when you have it in full screen mode, points for Bruce, he had it ready to go, but then it covers your channels. That makes it hard. It covers your controls. It makes it hard. I'm with you, Bruce. I get it.
There we go. I had to figure out how to unmute myself. Thank you, Josie, for inviting me to join you today. going to be talking about is a set of research that I started working on back in March, largely in response to some of the local governments here in North Carolina calling with questions on how they can possibly prepare for the onslaught of what the pandemic was going to do to their financial position. It started with one of the smaller counties in the state called about 2 weeks into the pandemic, and they had already gone through their rainy day funds and were on the verge of collapse. And they were just kind of trying to figure out what to do. And the question kept coming back to, well, that depends because we don't know how bad it's going to be or how long it's going to last. Which just brings up a number of questions. We talk a lot about the pandemic in terms of the size of the pandemic, how do we address the pandemic, what's the pandemic doing to us right now, but there's also this concern as to we need to understand what that's going to start looking like to us, what our communities are going to be like as the length of the pandemic keeps going on. The CDC announced yesterday that they are relatively certain that everybody would have a vaccine available to them by the end of 2021, but that's still about a year and a half away. So it is possible that this becomes a fairly long-term, large event, even more so than it already is. So what I did with a co-author is we looked at 2 states. We looked at Florida and we looked at North Carolina in terms of the potential for what the pandemic is going to mean for the fiscal health of the counties in both of those states. One of the kind of nice or interesting things of looking at different counties and different locations is provides us very different viewpoints. As Craig was talking about, in Nebraska, you're fairly property tax dependent. North Carolina, we typically are a little bit more sales tax dependent with a little bit of revenue diversification. And Florida is very, very heavily local option sales tax, relying on property tax for some things, but predominantly money coming in from tourists. So thinking about the impact of COVID on different states gives us kind of a different understanding as to what it might mean for different communities and how we can potentially respond within our own communities so that we can avoid some kind of catastrophe. Now, that said, what we did is we basically started thinking about, since we don't know the full effect of what it was going to be, we conducted a simulation that would reduce the sales tax from 5% all the way through 50% over an continuing period of time. So we started by if it just lasted through the 4th quarter of the fiscal year 2020, and then went quarter by quarter all the way through 2021. Now, in North Carolina, the typical county receives about 25 to 30% of their revenue from sales tax, so it's a fairly decent sales tax dependency. But we also have a fairly large variation within the state in terms of our economic, demographic, and political variation. So if you think about places like Raleigh, Johnson County, which is just south of Raleigh, is remarkably rural, whereas Raleigh's fairly large, fairly built up. So even within close proximity, we have large variation, kind of similar in some ways that you might have in Nebraska. Once you leave Omaha and Lincoln, everything's much more rural. By the end of March, a lot of the counties in the state were starting to see declines in their sales tax revenue. The state was telling counties to expect to have at least a 5% decline. Anecdotally, most counties have observed about a 25% decline in their sales tax revenue, which is a fairly decent bit of revenue at the end of the day. It's about $8 million for some of the smaller counties and upwards of about $50 million for places like Wake County, which is where I live here in Raleigh. Now, what we did is we considered the fiscal health of the counties. So what we want to know and understand is kind of where the counties themselves started off with. So what you have up on your screen is going to be the counties in North Carolina, assuming that COVID didn't happen, where the red county is going to be a very fiscally stressed county. So a county that has a operating ratio of less than 0.85. So they're spending a lot more than they really bring in. Whereas our orange counties are just going to be stressed counties, which is between a 0.85 and a 1. So they're spending more than they bring in, but not necessarily that much more. And then the border counties are the ones that are kind of going the 1 for 1. And then we have a wide range of healthier counties. Now, as we start dropping the sales tax rate, what we're starting to see is, of course, that increase in the number of counties who are experiencing fiscal health. So we go from one county that was very stressed to also we have 2 counties that are very stressed, and then an increase of 5 more counties that are stressed themselves. Probably more importantly is as we are now past that first quarter, we're going into the second quarter of 21, and we start to see that impact, the long-term impact of the pandemic is really starting to hit home because more and more of the counties start to become fiscally stressed. As it extends through first quarter 2021, we have 18 who are going to be very stressed, 2 who are stressed, or 2 who are very stressed, 18 who are very stressed. My apologies. And if it lasts all the way through the end of the year, we start jumping up to where we have 4 who are going to be very stressed, 21 who are stressed. And more importantly, if it lasts till next summer, we kind of hit this catastrophe of where we have 4 who are very stressed and 33 of the counties around the state who are very stressed. Why this matters is because if we are relying upon revenue coming into the local governments to provide services, as the economies do a little bit worse, there's a larger demand for public services. As the pandemic continues, there's a larger demand for public services. So it becomes kind of the perfect storm for local governments around the state to start collapsing upon themselves. As of yesterday, we have 2 counties who are in the state who have asked the legislature for permission to declare bankruptcy. And we have a couple cities who have asked for the permission, but the state has said that they will not allow that yet. Now we do have a worst case scenario. Thankfully, it doesn't look like North Carolina is going to hit that worst case, which is if we have a 50% reduction in sales tax, where we have, in that case, I did not actually count how many we have. Nearly everybody is either very stressed or stressed. Definitely not a good place for the state to be. On the other hand, if we consider a place like Florida, who their sales tax dependency is relatively mixed. Overall, as the general sales tax, they typically aren't that tax dependent, but they are fairly dependent on local option sales tax. And that's really designed to take advantage of people coming into the state for tourism. As with other states, such as Nebraska or North Carolina, we do have a fairly large bit of variation within the state. Everybody thinks about Florida as being Orlando and Miami. If you go up to the northern part of the state, it's highly agricultural, highly rural. So we have kind of this night and day distinction between the 2. Unlike North Carolina, though, Florida, we have a much kind of more dire situation. That is, we aren't sure of what the final impact of sales tax reduction is going to be, but the state has imposed a 50% cut. So anything that comes in, no matter what, the local government's only going to get 50% of it. The state's going to keep the rest. Probably not the best situation for anybody. What we have is going to be, just to give you an idea of the dependency and where or who's going to be reliant upon what kind of revenue for the state. So what we want to look at are going to be the green and the lighter green counties up on your screen. The green on the left-hand side are going to be those that are highly dependent on sales tax. On the right-hand side, the green are going to be those that are highly dependent on the local option sales tax, which in Florida are predominantly tourism related. And you can fairly easily tell which are going to be the counties that are tourism locations. So you have Hillsborough County where Tampa is, you have Orange County where Orlando is, Miami-Dade County. Up on the Panhandle, you have over Escambia County where you have Pensacola. So you have these very tourism industry locations that have relied upon that to be their source of revenue. Now, just as with North Carolina, we have the baseline of what their fiscal health would be if the pandemic wasn't happening, which is the one on your left-hand side. In this case, we only have 3 of the counties are actually stressed and no counties are very stressed. As we move forward with a larger decline, we start to see more and more of those counties kind of start to make that transition over. So on your right-hand side of a 10% decline, we still have the same 3 who are going to be stressed, but we're moving more into that borderline. As that increases, that is the share of, or the cut that's coming to them increases to 25%, we start to see a little bit larger of a transition. Now we end up with 4 who are very stressed, all the way over to the right-hand side of your screen that's going to be if there's a 50% cut, where there's a fairly large number who are going to be stressed. Now, what you're looking at is a fairly realistic perception of what happened in Florida in the fourth quarter on that right-hand side, because we have a 50% cut that was imposed. Florida does where all these sales tax goes to the state and the state redistributes it back out. So the state has a fairly easily opportunity to impose that cut on their own to keep the money that they're going to need in order to keep the state afloat at the risk of the counties. Now, what happens as this starts to become a longer term event like we're starting to see? Well, as it becomes longer, we start to have more and more of those counties still become stressed. At the 25% level, though, we don't have anybody who becomes very stressed. They're just kind of over the edge, but haven't fully fallen over yet. That starts to change when we start to accept that it's going to be that 50% decline for Florida, which our right-hand side, we have that 50% decline if it lasts all the way through the end of fiscal year 21, which also explains a little bit of why Florida pushed so hard to reopen, because they're trying to avoid this nightmare scenario that they're going to be relatively, faced with in the near future. There's a couple of takeaways that I want to note from this. One is that revenue diversification is definitely important. What's helping North Carolina in a way that's not helping Florida is that North Carolina has a larger number of revenue sources. The problem is that they're highly dependent on one of them. Florida, on the other hand, has fewer revenue sources, but they're extremely dependent on one. And so when that one revenue source takes a hit, it becomes massively impactful for Florida. But it also means that as long as everything else stays stable, they're able to do and exist kind of in a relatively stable manner themselves. Whereas North Carolina, we have a lot more shifts taking place because a lot more is really going on at that one point in time. It also means that we need to start thinking about how we approach cutback management for local governments. It's not likely to be a pandemic that's over in the next few weeks. It's something that's going to be ongoing. We don't fully know the extent in which it's going to impact the fiscal condition of local governments, which means we need to start thinking about how do we make those adjustments that we're going to need to make over the next year in order to be able to keep our organizations afloat. As much as I like to argue that we provide everything and sacrifice the government, it's important for us to keep our governments open, otherwise no services are provided on their own. What this also kind of points to, though, is that there's a need to build a better relationship back between the local governments and the states. Local governments are feeling the brunt of the pandemic financially, whereas states, while they're still feeling the impact, are able to kind of absorb a little bit more of that. At the same time, the states really aren't kind of helping back the local governments, and that assistance is definitely going to be needed in that regards, especially as this becomes a longer and longer term reality that we're living in. The two studies that this is based off of, the links for you up on your screen. The top one is looking at what's going on in Florida. The second one is looking at what's going on in North Carolina. The second one is definitely the more extensive of the two, whereas the Florida one kind of takes the concept of what we did for North Carolina and applies it back to another state. But they are both good resources in terms of kind of thinking about different ways that the pandemic might start to impact our local communities and how we can respond back to them.
Thank you so much, Bruce. We are going to bring the whole panel back. I think you can, yep, stop your share, be sending us some questions, and we're looking forward to having a conversation about all the great information you presented. I think the first one that I want to ask about is this concept of fiscal health, and maybe even we can go broader like economic health. Bring Chris in a little bit more. Seems to me that there's a lot of ways to define it, but you wouldn't want to go with sort of just one metric. So maybe talk about a couple of the things you're looking at, and maybe, for a paper you have one specific thing you want to talk about in context of fiscal health, but what else are you thinking about and watching for when you're talking about state or local government fiscal or economic health?
I'll start and Bruce can Bruce can chime in. In certain respects, it's contextual. And that was one of the points I was really hoping that, that we could make when presenting mine relative to Bruce's. And we've spent 40 years, there is so much literature on this. Now, what I've done for Nebraska, and it's controversial, I get it, but the reality is most Nebraska cities are really small. Most of them aren't doing financial audit reports, and so you don't have the level of data sophistication that we often look at. And so what I've done is I've narrowed it down to sort of four metrics. I look at fund balance, so reserves relative to expenditures in some comparison form. I look at change in reserves over a several year period. I look at debt levels and I look at change in debt levels. And so I've defined a fiscally challenged community in Nebraska as one in which you've got low reserves that have been decreasing over time, coupled with high debt that's been increasing over time. And for what it's worth, for all the counties that we've studied in Nebraska over a 15-year period, I'm happy to say that at the moment, there are no fiscally distressed counties. Next is municipalities, but counties, at least for now, we're in pretty good shape.
I can jump in. So if we think about fiscal health as being the capacity of a government to meet its financial obligations, basically can it pay its bills, there's about 200 different financial ratios that you can use to measure fiscal health. All of them kind of come back to that same question: can you pay your bills? It's whether we can think about it short-term or versus long-term. In the context of the study that I was looking at, we looked at it purely from the short-term perspective. So looking at the operating ratio, do you have the money to pay your bills today? We can think long-term when you get there, but thinking about long-term doesn't really help you if everybody is out of work today, if everybody actually needs the help today. Part of that is we don't know what the long-term impact would be, so trying to forecast that out or predict that out would be fairly tricky.
Bruce, any thoughts on broader economic health?
Well, yeah, it might take us a little far afoot here. I definitely have to defer to Craig and Bruce on the state and local fiscal situations and the appropriate measures there. When I look at an economy as a whole, and I ask the question, is an economy quote unquote at risk? I tend to look at two things, and again, this is not universally accepted, and I imagine I got a lot of colleagues who might dispute this. One thing I tend to look at is the overall, the number and size of different sectors in an economy. It's kind of like having a diversified portfolio. If you've got more diverse economy, that is, you've got more different types of businesses and different types of industries, you're going to be able to weather storms like this better than other economies. I've often compared Omaha's economy with something like Akron, Ohio, roughly the same size in terms of population. Akron's economy is so heavily vested in the automobile sector. Omaha's got a very diverse economy. So when you look at business cycles across different cities like that, those areas that have relatively few sectors really aren't able to weather storms as well as others. If the automobile industry takes a hit, Akron's in a lot of trouble. Not so much with Omaha. We've got a huge presence in transportation and banking and insurance, and that's why I worry about a lot of rural communities, because oftentimes you may have one or two companies that kind of define the economic base. And if those companies are hard hit, let's say by the coronavirus, and they're not able to survive, continue to export goods and so on, because demand is so low, they could close up shop, and that could have a damaging ripple effect through the economy. So those are some of the things that I tend to look at.
Yeah, and I think that plays well this idea of revenue diversification.
Exactly, right, exactly. The more diversified an economy, the more you can weather these storms, the better you can. Yeah.
Wonderful. Bruce, the next question is for you. Let's say we want to, in Nebraska, replicate your studies. What data could we use? What's available to be able to do it?
So in this case, we pulled the financial data directly from both Florida and North Carolina has a data center of all the local government financial data. I'm not sure if Nebraska has something similar. Some states do, some states don't. Craig's nodding his head yes. So using that, and then basically we just started going through and saying, well, let's understand how the revenue streams for the states work, and then start shifting the varying pieces of that financial data. So in North Carolina, shifting the overall sales tax rates or sales tax revenue collections down on a quarter by quarter basis. In Florida, it was looking at the sales tax, but also then making sure that we adjusted the local option sales taxes. For Nebraska, if it's looking at the sales tax, you're not fairly sales tax dependent from what Craig mentioned, but you're property tax dependent. So we can shift the sales tax for Nebraska to see what happens, but it might be worth also considering, well, what happens when we start shifting that property tax to think of what happens next if we start to see an increase in foreclosures.
Absolutely, and I will say Nebraska Department of Revenue puts out a lot of those numbers, and we also have some of them on the governing.unomaha.edu site. Yeah, Craig?
I would just add, so this is something that the lab I've been trying to manage also has, and if you're looking for local government, whether it's school district, special purpose district, municipalities, counties, every entity has to submit a financial report. So it's similar format to the state office of the auditor. And so all of those data are available. Got to do some work on them, but those data are there.
Great. Another question. Let's imagine the scenario where everything does go back to normal December 2021. Can local governments in Nebraska, other places ride out this storm? Can we avoid major cuts in service levels if things are back to normal by 2021?
Well, based upon what I know in terms of reserves that lots of local governments in Nebraska are sitting on, the property tax, if folks haven't lost an ability to pay those to a sizable degree. So it could be, to Chris's point, and if there's a second stimulus package, if something comes up, and the state budget was just passed and there isn't really anything in terms of draconian cuts from the state, I don't see a scenario where many local governments in Nebraska are really going to be in if we even had the ability, sort of a bankruptcy mode by the end of 21. Nonprofits, yes, but local governments, I don't see that scenario.
So I don't know if I'm speaking directly to this, but I think Craig is echoing what would make sense to me. The slower the recovery, the longer it's going to be to get back to normal. That's for sure. So if we have a stimulus in place that offers some security in terms of things like tax revenues on the property side or on the retail sales side, that's certainly going to help local governments weather this storm. I would be inclined to think, though, that there are likely going to be some difficulties ahead, at least in terms of state and local government, certainly on the local side. But what really is going to help these local governments are the degree to which a recovery is sustainable. And that's why I put out as a caveat, it's like, okay, look, if we are going to see a recovery by the end of 2021 or 2022, Two, it's really got to be a steady increase followed by some rapid increases. If we don't get a stimulus that's meaningful, that's going to delay things, and that will have ripple effects through the recovery. So, and part of the problem is if you don't provide a sufficient support for an ailing economy, you know, a lot of people aren't going to be able to spend because they don't have the money to do so, and that's going to make it hard for them to make payments as necessary. And if they're paying their mortgage rate tax or their mortgage taxes, etc. These are real issues. What's really needed, I think, now is I think one more solid injection will help get us to that goal, and that's probably what's going to help state and local governments avoid major cuts.
Right. Another question back for you, Chris. One of the things that we noticed when we were putting together the Nebraska Economic Recovery Dashboard, one of the key metrics everyone asks us about is wages. And Nebraska's wages usually lag, you know, peer states, US averages, you know, break it down by occupation, break it down by demographics. We tend to lag. There was some good progress coming into the last couple quarters before the pandemic, especially in Omaha, especially in the metro areas of Nebraska. I worry that when we come out of the pandemic, will we reset at those high levels? Will we sort of reset and have that growth trajectory that we were on? So even when you're modeling it, do you suspect sort of slow growth? Is it going to be a boom coming right back? What do we expect to see?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is true that when you take a look at wages in Nebraska compared to other states, we're not as high. The counterbalance to that is cost of living is relatively low, and that can be helpful as well. So you have a real good living wage going forward. And you're right, we did start seeing some increases in wages as well. Given right now the slack in the labor market, I think I don't want to necessarily say the word reset is in order, but I do think that I don't think we'll pop back in terms of wages and incomes as quickly as we will in terms of jobs. So on that front, that could take a little bit longer. I will say that Omaha in particular has the kind of economy that can retain high-paying jobs. And at least that's something that I've noticed over the last few years. That will help through the recovery process, but there may be a bit of a lag there when compared with other cities of similar size.
Throw this one back to everyone. I think in some way everybody mentioned sort of a difference between a rural economy and a metropolitan economy, a rural-urban divide, and their sort of ability to weather a storm and their ability to come back. One of the things we've seen in our research, right, to Chris's point, different occupations in different areas. So occupations that can work from home, they're still flourishing, they're still doing okay, while manufacturing, entertainment, tourism, recreation, those things of arts and entertainment have really gotten hurt. Do we expect to see that sort of trickle down to our local governments? How do the differences in metro and urban areas affect the ability of those areas as communities to rebound? Is that clear?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just say, and I think there's another layer to that, and there's these sort of the micropolitan communities as well. And so in some respects, those communities outside of your Omaha and Lincoln are feeding off of the growth that's been occurring in those cities. The degree to which Omaha and Lincoln can manage and get through this, the better off those communities contiguous to them are going to be. The rural communities, and Chris can speak much better to this than I can. The rural communities, It's a very different game here in Nebraska. It's much more, in many respects, sort of ag driven, and so those markets are going to determine what's going to be happening. At least I think in those areas, which is why we saw in 2007, 2008, in general, Nebraska got through that recession a heck of a lot better than just about every other state, and it was because of that mix of sectors. Chris, please tell me I at least got some point of that correct.
No, that sounds quite reasonable. Again, different sectors are gonna manage cycles differently. The Great Recession had a major problem for a lot of economies that were heavily vested in finance, the financial sectors, largely because that was root cause of some have argued root cause of that recession. Commodities did very well. Challenges right now for a rural economy that are heavily vested, let's say primarily in agriculture, are going to be looking at the supply chain associated with ag through processing, through grocery stores, and consumers probably they can't really curb too much spending on groceries. The problem we might have with a rural economy, for example, is if meat processors, for example, experiencing outbreaks. I explain this to my students all the time. It's a basic supply and demand story. What happens is if you've got disruption at some link in the supply chain, okay, fine, that's going to hurt the downstream consumers because there's not as much product to purchase. It's also going to hurt ag. Why? Well, because there's no longer much of a demand for the livestock. And what we've seen happen in Nebraska is a lot of Nebraska farmers having a hard time selling some of their livestock for this purpose. Now, some of that could come back if we can control these outbreaks. That would help out quite a bit. The challenge, I think, with a lot of rural communities where they're so heavily vested in one sector like ag, is that if one primary basic sector is hit, and that's your primary base, then the mom and pop stores that are there because of those base industries are going to take a major hit. And why I think a lot of rural communities that don't have a diversified economy in place might find it difficult to weather events like this as well as others. No question, Craig, you're absolutely right that the industrial mix matters. And in fact, as I consider a post-COVID-19 environment, I don't want to jump ahead here, but one of the things I'd like to look at is what types and how many of businesses haven't survived. And is that having some impact on the industrial structure of both rural and metropolitan communities, and by the way, micropolitan communities as well? Because if we see a huge loss of businesses, I mean, actual establishments in certain sectors, that can be a long-term disruption that could be hard for an economy as a whole to weather.
Thanks.
I don't know if that speaks to things, but yeah.
Be getting your questions in. I just have a couple more. So if you get them in now, we'll still have time. I'm going to throw this one at Bruce and Craig, and you're not going to like answering it. I know it. Chris argued we need another stimulus. Seems to me, my observation has been that any stimulus that has happened has really been focused on the private sector. What should we be doing for local governments, and how important is it?
I don't know if it's a bad question to answer. It's just a hard question to answer. I think part of the problem local governments have, at least in the east part of the U.S., we typically provide a lot more public health. So Wake County here in North Carolina has its own hospitals. A lot of the counties in Florida have their own hospitals, in addition to just a public health department. So when somebody goes in because they have COVID, they can't pay their bill because it becomes hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's the county who gets set with that. It becomes a very kind of all-around difficult situation. It's not the state who's receiving the brunt of it. It is the local governments. Businesses are definitely feeling it, but we want to keep the local governments afloat. So we have to be able to provide something back to them, even if it's just a small little bit that says, here's enough to keep your doors open another week. There are definitely going to be some communities that even if it's small, that matters. You know, a lot of the larger governments are the ones who are more diversified. And so when the CARES money came through, they were the ones who were able to actually withstand it better. It was some of the medium-sized communities and smaller communities who actually probably needed the funding more.
Yeah, I don't think I mean, I'll just add a couple of things, right? So to Bruce's point, you know, especially counties in the Great Plains, Midwest area, these are creatures of the state, and their function is to execute sort of state responsibilities, and Health and Human Services is the lion's share of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you think about how COVID has affected the ability to service these individuals, the demand for those additional services, whether it be employment, whether it be health, you name it. That's all being felt at the local level. And if, to Chris's point, again, you know, if we're smart, right, what we should be doing is certain things. If there's an outbreak, you sort of lock things down. And in doing so, the fiscal effect is going to be most immediate and most dramatic at the local level, especially if you're heavily reliant on consumers. So to me, it's sort of it's to Bruce's, and I think I strongly support Bruce's point. Even just thinking about, you know, PPE and things and all these additional demands, darn right, local governments should be getting some. And that's the hard part here in Nebraska is none of the cities are large enough to meet that 500,000 population threshold. So now they're having to I'll say work with the state government to try to get some funding from the CARES Act.
Thanks. Okay, we have some questions coming in. I think we need a little economics lesson. What's the effect for local governments on a large federal stimulus? So how does that move through the economy to return to normal? How do we need a stimulus?
You want me to try to answer that?
We'll try.
Well, if I'm understanding the question, the concern is we got this CARES Act money coming through. How is it filtering through? I think for a lot of these things, there are a couple of touch points which at least the last act tried to measure. I have to tell you, I've not been privy to any specific studies that have focused on CARES alone and asked the question, what's the economic impact of CARES? Which is an important question to ask, by the way. If we could get a handle on how much money actually came in to residents in Nebraska, to small businesses in Nebraska, which we would probably get a hold of at some point and then measure what the resulting multiplier effect of that would be. My suspicion is it would be quite meaningful. But when we look at the way I see a lot of the stimulus coming through, when you have a $600 a week add-on to unemployment check, that's money in the hands of spenders. As an economist, that is something I would tend to support because it does put the hands or put the money in the hands of the people who are going to engage in transactions, and that's going to have a ripple effect through other sectors, including it should support some state and local government coffers as well. To the extent you've got some small business relief to help manage debt and so forth. My understanding is that while there are some institutions, I think that filters through. Ultimately, it's designed to get to the small business. And again, that's something that as an economist, I'd be supportive of, right? Because to the extent we can avoid two things with respect to business closures, right? One is there's the immediate effect. You've lost capital, you've lost jobs. The psychological effect is that gets reported on the news, and that can send a bunch of consumers into the doldrums and become quite concerned about their own economic health. So to the extent that works with respect to those that engage directly in transactions, I think that's a good thing. I want to circle back, though, to something that Craig had said and something that Bruce had said. Essential services that aren't provided by a market are provided by business, by governments, rather. And those essential services during a pandemic, if they're starved of resources, that's not going to have a significant benefit to the economy. In fact, it's going to be a detriment. So I'm going to do something that maybe some of my colleagues in the economics department would disagree with, but I'm going to echo the concerns that Craig and Bruce have mentioned. Guess what? I think there is some real benefit to having some fiscal money to local governments.
Public goods. That's all we're providing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. There was a follow-up that touched on what you were talking about. What analysis has been done regarding measuring the impact of CARES money in Nebraska? Has transparency been an issue? I think we haven't really seen anything to date. Anybody looking in other states or know anybody who is? Point two.
I know people in North Carolina have tried to look at it from North Carolina's perspective, and the transparency has been an issue, trying to figure out who actually got what resources. I would assume that's probably the same in most other states.
Yeah, and that's key to measuring an economic impact, right? Because you need to know exactly who's got the money, what sectors have benefited the most, what consumer groups have, and unless you have that, then you know the multiplier is not going to be terribly meaningful. My hope is that, of course, I think it might be a while yet before we're able to, if at all, we're able to get a hold of that data. It's certainly a worthwhile study and a series of studies to produce, because this isn't going to be the last epidemic that we'll have to deal with. I'm sure, hopefully it won't be in the next few years, but certainly these things aren't going to go away. I mean, the next COVID is going to occur. The question is, can we learn enough about its impact from this experience to help us in the future?
Hot topic in the news. I don't know if you guys have comments on this. What impact could the USPS backups have on recovery?
That is a hot topic. Okay. Let me tell you my initial thoughts, and other than saying, yeah, it's got to, what I do find myself concerned with are the degree to which that essential monies that get distributed through the mail could be inhibited. That can generate some additional uncertainty in the eyes of consumers. And like I said before, if we have a group of consumers that are looking around, waiting for a check, waiting for some sort of payment, waiting for some sort of benefit, and they're not getting it, that's going to discourage a consumer's outlook on his or her economic health. And when that occurs, people aren't going to buy. And if people aren't coming into stores, if people aren't buying goods and services, businesses aren't going to invest. So it's unclear exactly how much of that could be happening. To me, it's enough of a risk to say it could be having an initial psychological effect. It's of concern. I haven't seen any studies to this effect, though. So I started it. I'll let you guys close out.
I'll add one thing we don't really talk too much about is that people are heavily post office dependent right now, not just for those checks coming in, but for the things that they're purchasing online, so they don't have to go out into public. As local governments are highly dependent on that sales tax revenue from things that they're buying, as shipping of goods becomes more expensive, it becomes harder, people buy less online, and they're not going to the store, so they're just buying less. So there definitely is a reliance between the local financial condition of governments with the need to have that post office continuing to still operate, particularly in some of the smaller, more rural communities. So places like Raleigh, where I live, lots of places I can go. I can go to the grocery store at 3 o'clock in the morning to buy something if I wanted to and avoid the crowds. If you live in a smaller community, you probably don't have that same capacity. So you rely on that postal service in its place.
Yeah, and I'll just take that just one step further, and it goes back to Chris's discussion about supply chain. I'm a pretty avid cyclist, and I went to a local bike shop. There's nothing in the store, and so there are going to be disruptions, and there are going to be disruptions at multiple points, and the degree to which we can mitigate any of those, I think, is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for answering that. Another question coming in, I think this is going to go to Bruce and Craig as we talk about sort of Nebraska and being property tax dependent. What is worse for the local economy? Prolonged housing growth, which we do have in Nebraska Economic Recovery Dashboard, you can see it there, or a fairly short period of foreclosures?
I would probably say
I guess the argument, what he's trying to say is, right, housing growth would price people out of the market, or would take away that cost of living factor that we have going for us. Does foreclosures reset the economy?
I don't think foreclosures reset the economy. I think foreclosures create a perception of the condition of the economy. If you have a short period of foreclosures, you can kind of explain that away. Whereas if you have stalled prolonged housing growth, you then have a harder time attracting business into your community, have a harder time attracting or convincing that business to expand, because they're going to say, well, there's a broader issue within the community. Whereas if you have a period of 2 or 3 months where there's a lot of foreclosures, it's short-term worse for the community, but you can explain it away probably a little easier for the long-term situation in terms of kind of what's going on.
Yeah, I completely agree with Bruce. I think it's sort of like the analogy of, location, and I do think there are these cues to which Bruce referred to that are critical.
Great. All right, I want to close with one question. We can just go around and everybody can answer it. And I want to thank you all so much for doing this and being here, and your great presentation and great responses. We're going to rebuild. So, we're looking at what happens after a pandemic, or during a pandemic. Unfortunately, we're still in it. What do you want coming out of it? What are the things that we could build back into our systems, build back into our institutions to be a more resilient economy, to have more resilient budgets in the future? And I think Bruce and Chris too, I think you can even speak to some like economic development ideas. And so if you can build that in, I think a Nebraska audience is interested in that topic right now.
Well, I'm not going to answer the question directly. But one of the things I truly do hope that comes out of, in addition to preparation, right, having systems in place for this potentially happening again, but I study local governments. I am really hoping and really curious to see the extent to which modes of service delivery and management of personnel will change over the long term. There's no reason that certain services, permits, etc., one needs to continue to go to the city hall to purchase. I hope some of those things changes. In addition to, I do think there are some valid discussions about the degree to which folks have to be in one's office from 8 o'clock in the morning until 5 p.m. I think we've seen there are more efficient and effective ways of doing that. And now that's going to pose some HR questions, but I would like to see the conversation going down those paths.
Well, I'll try to answer it sort of directly. I don't know if I can really answer the question, what do I want to see happening, so much as what I'm confident is going to happen, and whether or not I think those are efficiency gains or not. First of all, similar to Craig, I think a lot of businesses have been discovering that, at least businesses that have been resistant to remote work. I think they're finding there are certain efficiencies there that they didn't realize were there. So I suspect that's a trend that's going to continue, and I think that could lead to some efficiency measures that would likely pressure an expansion of broadband services into rural areas that are currently lacking some of that service. That could probably be an efficiency gainer for rural states like Nebraska. I know that some areas of the state have some limited broadband. So I think that could happen. I also think that in terms of management, what a lot of companies have discovered is the importance of a flexible, perhaps a more flexible supply chain. I think that a lot of meat processing companies, for example, are looking heavily into that now. If there's an outbreak of COVID cases in a meat processing plant somewhere in Nebraska, how quickly can we fill orders by mobilizing other plants that we might have? I think that's kind of a learning curve process that could lead to some efficiencies, and I think that could be a good thing. Not that I think these companies aren't already doing something like that. I just think that situations like this will intensify that kind of management practice going forward. Whether this is a good thing or not, people can debate it, but I also think that a lot of businesses are going to be looking for efficiencies, perhaps in the form of automation. To what extent can certain tasks be automated that might help minimize some of the impacts on businesses? Again, that could have some labor force disruption to it, and I wouldn't advocate one way or the other, but I do think that's a trend that's likely going to occur that could lead to some business efficiencies, I guess is what I would say. I don't know if those are things that I would say I want to see out of this, but there are things that I think are going to happen.
Thanks. Bruce?
Boy, it's tough. Part of me says I would like to see the governments respond by developing a larger set of rainy day funds. I would like to see that. I don't actually expect it to happen. After the Great Recession, we all talked about on the academic side that here's what local governments and state governments were going to do. And they all did that for about a year or two. And then all of a sudden everybody realized things are good and they stopped doing that. So I would like, or would hope that they would develop some kind of savings account that they can draw on for when things go bad. I don't actually expect it to happen. What I do expect to happen is probably more something along the line of what Craig and Chris mentioned, that there's going to be a larger technological focus and bringing that back to efficiency. So thinking about things like smart cities and smart communities, where we can implement tools and technology and ways of thinking about how we develop and implement and grow our communities that are much more technologically savvy, much more built around how people engage communities rather than how people have historically just kind of lived and existed. So I think we'll see a large transition in that way. There might be some cost savings for us, but also anytime you start adding technology, that becomes more expensive. So I think there'll be a shift in kind of how we end up using funds long term as well.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you all for attending. We will be back at that same link this afternoon. Recordings and presentations will be available later at our conference webpage. We appreciate you all so much, and we will see you this afternoon, and go have a great lunch.